When World War II ended in Europe, the guns fell silent, but the questions only multiplied. On May 7, 1945, Nazi Germany signed an unconditional surrender to the Allied powers. 2 days later, the war in Europe officially ended. After nearly 6 years of global conflict, millions breathed a sigh of relief. Yet, amid the ruins of cities like Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and Leipzig, devastation was staggering. Families were torn apart, millions of civilians had been displaced, infrastructure lay in shambles, railways and roads were unusable, factories were destroyed, food and medical supplies were scarce, the Third Reich, which had once controlled vast portions of Europe, was gone. Adolf Hitler was dead. His closest allies had either surrendered, fled, or taken their own lives. Germany itself was divided into zones of occupation, controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and later France. But the collapse of the regime did not automatically answer the most pressing question: what would become of the individuals who had made the Nazi system function? The Third Reich had been more than a government, it was a complex, bureaucratic machine. Millions of individuals had contributed in some capacity: soldiers, police officers, SS officers, camp guards, bureaucrats, industrial managers, engineers, doctors, and administrators. Some were perpetrators of direct violence, others had performed mundane tasks that nevertheless enabled systemic atrocities. As the Allies took control of Germany and occupied territories, it became clear that justice would not be straightforward. Some Nazis would face the courts, others would vanish into obscurity. Some would flee abroad, others would quietly reintegrate into post-war society, and some, even decades later, would still be found responsible for their roles in a regime. This is the story of the fate of the Nazis after World War II, a story of justice, escape, reintegration, and the difficult task of confronting history. The collapse of Nazi Germany. By early 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. The tide of war had shifted decisively against the Nazis. In the east, the Soviet Red Army advanced relentlessly, pushing through Poland and into eastern Germany. Cities were captured after fierce battles, and civilians were caught in the crossfire. Entire German divisions crumbled or surrendered, unable to resist the overwhelming force of the Soviet advance. Civilians fled westward in massive, chaotic columns, often under heavy bombardment and freezing conditions. Thousands died from hunger, exposure, or artillery fire while attempting to escape the front lines. In the west, American, British, and French forces crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into the heart of Germany. Air superiority allowed them to disrupt the transport lines, strike industrial centers, and cut off supply routes. German forces were demoralized and exhausted, fighting often with insufficient resources and no clear strategic plan. Inside Germany, the state itself was collapsing. Railways ceased to function. Bridges were destroyed, communications with Berlin became sporadic or non-existent. Regional officials often received conflicting orders, leaving them paralyzed between compliance and survival. Despite the inevitable defeat, Nazi leadership refused to acknowledge reality. Propaganda continued to emphasize final victory or heroic resistance. Even as cities fell and supply lines vanished, civilian populations were mobilized into Volkssturm, a militia of teenagers and elderly men, ill-equipped and poorly trained to resist the Allies. When Germany finally surrendered, it was sudden, absolute, and total. There was no transitional government, no negotiated settlement, and no gradual handover of authority. Nazi institutions ceased to function overnight. The Allies assumed control, dividing the country into occupation zones and establishing military governments. For former Nazis, the future was uncertain and dangerous. Many feared arrest, trial, or retribution. Others tried to escape into anonymity, blending back into the civilian population. The sheer scale of involvement in the Nazi system made sorting guilt from survival nearly impossible. Arrests, flight, and suicide. The immediate months after surrender saw a flurry of arrests. High-ranking Nazi leaders were primary targets. Allied intelligence agencies had prepared lists of wanted individuals well before Germany's surrender. Some were apprehended quickly. Others attempted to escape, disguising themselves as ordinary soldiers or civilians. Several high-profile figures chose suicide rather than face capture. understanding that the consequences of defeat would be severe. Notable examples include Adolf Hitler's deputy Heinrich Himmler, who attempted to evade capture by disguising himself as a Wehrmacht soldier, only to be arrested and commit suicide in British custody. Joseph Goebbels and his wife poisoned their children before taking their own lives. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's close confidant, surrendered but would later face execution at Nuremberg, so he took his own life. Below the top leadership, the situation had become more complicated. Millions of Germans had been party members, held office positions, or served in administrative roles. Sorting the guilty from the innocent became one of the greatest challenges of the post-war period. Some communities reported former officials to Allied authorities. Others remained silent either out of fear, loyalty, or exhaustion after years of occupation. Identification relied heavily on surviving documents, which were often destroyed or falsified. Witness testimonies were inconsistent, and many claimed ignorance or downplayed their involvement. The scale of the challenge was staggering. Millions had been complicit to varying degrees in the Nazi system, whether through active participation, professional duty, or coerced compliance. The scale of responsibility. By 1945, over 8.5 million Germans had been members of the Nazi Party. Millions more had served in institutions that directly supported the regime. Schools were teaching Nazi ideology. Judges were enforcing racial laws. Doctors performed forced sterilizations and human experiments. Industrial managers exploited forced labor. Engineers designed weapons and infrastructure to further the war effort. Even outside Germany, collaborators in occupied countries had participated in supporting Nazi governance. In France, Norway, and the Netherlands, local police and bureaucrats assisted in deportations and administration of occupation policies. The reach of Nazi influence extended beyond Germany's borders, making accountability an international concern. The Allies quickly realized that punishing everyone was impossible, yet doing nothing was unacceptable. Justice had to be selective, targeting those whose responsibility was greatest and whose actions could be proven. Deciding how justice should be done. Allied leaders debated how to prosecute the architects of Nazi crimes. Some argued for immediate execution of top figures, believing their guilt was undeniable. Others insisted on formal trials, arguing that only public proceedings could document the crimes and set a historical record. The decision to hold trials was both legal and symbolic. It demonstrated that even heads of state and top officials could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. It also created a historical record that could prevent denial and revisionism in the future. In preparation, the Allies collected extensive evidence. Thousands of documents, photographs, and testimonies were gathered. Witnesses were interviewed. Film footage from concentration and labor camps were compiled to demonstrate the reality of Nazi atrocities. Why Nuremberg was chosen. Nuremberg had been a symbolic center of Nazi power. Massive party rallies had taken place there, showcasing discipline, obedience, and ideological fervor. The city was damaged but retained structures capable of housing international proceedings, including a courthouse large enough for the press, judges, lawyers, and observers. By choosing Nuremberg, the Allies sent a powerful message. The city that had once glorified the regime would now witness its judgment. In November 1945, the International Military Tribunal convened, with judges representing the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Inside the Nuremberg trial, 24 senior Nazi officials were indicted. They represented political leadership, military command, diplomacy, and administration. Defendants included Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Albert Speer, and others. The trials were public and meticulously documented. Evidence came largely from Nazi records themselves, orders, reports, and internal communications that demonstrated how policies were planned and executed. Survivor testimonies and film footage from liberated camps provided an undeniable record of atrocities. The most striking aspect of the trials was the bureaucratic nature of the crimes. Decisions made in offices through memos, meetings, and schedules had led to the death of millions. The trials revealed how systematic murder could be administered, as well as an organized program. Verdicts and their limits. In October 1946, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. 12 defendants were sentenced to death. 3 received life imprisonment and others received long prison terms. Several were acquitted due to lack of evidence. Executions were carried out shortly afterward. Nuremberg established crucial legal precedents. Following orders was not a defense, and individuals could be held accountable for actions carried out in the name of the state. Yet, the trials only addressed the top leadership. Millions of mid-level officials and ordinary citizens who had sustained the regime were never prosecuted. Follow-up trials and professional accountability. Nuremberg was only the beginning. Subsequent trials were conducted by Allied military authorities, focusing on specific professions and institutions. Doctors were prosecuted for conducting human experiments. Judges were tried for enforcing racial laws. Industrialists were charged with exploiting forced labor for profit. These trials highlighted the breadth of Nazi involvement and demonstrated how ordinary professional roles had been co-opted into the machinery of mass violence. They also revealed the difficulty of determining individual guilt in a system designed to fragment responsibility. Denazification and its challenges. The Allies introduced denazification to remove Nazi influence from public life. Germans were required to complete detailed questionnaires outlining party membership and wartime roles. Based on this information, individuals were categorized as major offenders, active participants, or minimal participants. Denazification quickly ran into problems. Millions of cases overwhelmed administrators. Evidence was incomplete, witnesses were unavailable, and appeals flooded the system. By early 1950s, enforcement had weakened, especially in West Germany, where economic recovery and political stability took precedence over continued prosecution. West Germany and a return to normal life. In West Germany, pragmatism gradually replaced strict denazification. Experienced professionals were needed to rebuild the state. Many had Nazi-era backgrounds but were now considered essential for government, industry, and education. Former party members quietly turned to positions of influence, often without public scrutiny. This reintegration was critical to the nation's recovery, yet it created tensions. Questions about accountability and morality persisted for decades. Escape routes and new identities. Not all Nazis stayed in Europe. Informal escape networks, later called rat lines, helped thousands flee abroad. Italy and Spain became transit points, from where fugitives traveled to South America, the Middle East, and other regions with weak extradition agreements. Some lived openly, others adopted new identities and avoided attention for decades. A number of these individuals would later be captured, whilst most disappeared permanently. Former Nazis in the Cold War. The onset of the Cold War complicated moral accountability. Both the United States and the Soviet Union recruited German scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers. Expertise often outweighed ethical consideration. Former Nazis contributed to missile programs, industrial rebuilding, and intelligence operations. Moral judgments were postponed in favor of strategic necessity. A different approach in Eastern Europe. Soviet-controlled regions initially pursued harsh policies against former Nazis. Many were imprisoned, executed, or sent to labor camps. Over time, political loyalty became more important than past affiliation, and some were reintegrated into society under strict surveillance. Revenge and informal justice. The immediate post-war period was chaotic. Across Europe, suspected collaborators faced vigilante justice. Public humiliation, beatings, and executions occurred. These acts reflected trauma, fear, and anger accumulated over years of occupation. Late trials and historical memory. Even decades later, Germany and other countries continued investigations. Statutes of limitation on murder were removed. Elderly former camp guards and bureaucrats were prosecuted. These cases reinforced a lasting principle. Historical accountability does not expire with time, and society retains a moral responsibility to confront past crimes. Impact on post-war society. The reintegration of former Nazis shaped post-war Europe profoundly. Political institutions, education, law enforcement, and industrial sectors were influenced by individuals who had once served the regime. This reality complicated efforts to reconcile justice with reconstruction. Decisions made in the 1950s and 1960s continue to influence historical memory and collective conscience in Germany and Europe today. The defeat of Nazi Germany did not produce a single outcome for those who served the regime. Some were punished, some escaped justice, many quietly reintegrated into society. Others contributed to post-war reconstruction both in Europe and abroad. These divergent paths illustrate the complexity of confronting mass atrocity. Justice, memory, and historical accountability are really simple. They unfold over decades, influenced by politics, pragmatism, and human limitations. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing and press the bell icon for more in-depth history content. And as always, thank you for your time.